Good morning. Well, it's the morning in Orem, Utah, where I am today at my office at Utah Valley University. And hopefully, got a few people here who want to learn a little bit about the disasters that can happen when working with data, but also about persistence and understanding there's value even when things can get challenging. And if you're there, I would love to invite you to say hello in the comments and tell me where you are tuning in from. Love to see who is out there. Oh, Gladys, thanks for logging in where it is late for you. I'm grateful to have you here. It's a gray, drizzly day here in Salt Lake. It is currently 10 a.m. for me, but I know it gets to be later for other people. So if you're out there, I'd love to have you write a comment and say where you are. Otherwise, this may just be a very small little conversation between Gladys and me. Miranda, thank you for checking in from Virginia. And here is Gladys. Gladys, where are you located, by the way? But we do have Miranda from Virginia. Thank you for being here. And say hello. Tell me where you are. Gladys is hello from Germany and Peru. Probably not both at once, but thank you. I'm glad to have you here. And we have Dr. Abalawi from Orlando. Thank you for joining me. And Stella from Nigeria, where it is nighttime, I believe. And Krishna from California. Thank you so much for coming. It is one of the great things that I love about doing these events. And okay, we are going to see Amadou Baguchi. Almost got it. Good morning, tuning in from Canada. Thank you for coming. Okay, Gladys currently in Germany. But it's great to have you guys here. Thank you for coming. So I need to begin with a little qualification in that the title of this event is Sturgeon's Law for Data Work. And to Sturgeon's Law, it is kind of depressing. Oh, wait, and we have Amanda from Ireland. Thank you for joining. Sturgeon's Law, Theodore Sturgeon was a science fiction writer, and he had to deal with the challenge of being what's called a genre writer. So genre means that you're writing in science fiction, or you're writing historical fiction, or you're writing romance novels, or you're doing something that falls into a category, as opposed to what's just called like fiction with a capital F, which is what people consider the great novels. And genre fiction is often seen as a lesser form. And Theodore Sturgeon had to defend himself from the accusation. This was in the 50s, but it applies forever. Is that people were saying that, like, how could you write science fiction? Because science fiction novels are just crap. And he said, after some reflection, he says, 90% of everything is crap. And that's Sturgeon's Law. And so the realization, he says, it's not just science fiction. Epic poetry, 90% of that is going to be crap. Operas, 90% of them are going to be crap. Country western dances, 90% of them are going to be crap. Academic articles, 90% of them are going to be crap. 90% of everything is really bad. This should ring familiar to you. I've got, for instance, I've got movies that I love, but if I ever sit down and watch the whole thing from start to finish, I get irritated at parts of it that really drag or slow, or I know that other movies by the same people are just unwatchable. I have my favorite bands for music, and I don't like all of their albums, and even my very favorite albums by them, I don't like all of the songs. My wife and I go to modern dance performances frequently, and we have this little saying afterwards that you don't got to like it all. If you like absolutely everything, it tells us that you're probably not paying a lot of attention to quality as you go through. But where Sturgeon said 90% of everything is crap, what he's basically saying is you can't judge the quality of something by its category and by the existence of substandard work within that category, because that's going to happen everywhere. That there's going to be a much smaller percentage that is truly worthwhile. Now, I have noticed this in a few places in my life, and this is why I'm bringing this up today. Um, I'm in my office at my university. I am by profession a psychology professor, even though I talk about data science. My PhD is in social psychology. It's a research field. And what happened in social psychology a few years ago was, I'd say about 20 years ago, some people thought they might try looking at some very well-known classic or very intriguing recent studies in social psychology and see if they could replicate them. In my field, it's purely academic research. And by the way, I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm trained as an experimental researcher. But there's this huge emphasis placed on doing something new, and so people don't like to repeat old studies. But when a group of researchers tried to replicate some well-known studies, both classic ones and newer, more interesting ones, they found that maybe half of them, they couldn't replicate it. It just didn't seem to work. And they collaborated with other people trying to replicate well-known studies in social psychology. And again, at best, you had a 50% chance of replicating it. Now, the problem is a lot of people then started writing comments in newspapers and said, well, that's because psychology is not a real science. And that's because psychologists are stupid. And, that if they were real science, then everything would work. Well, okay, that's irritating for several reasons. One of which is, it's just that social psychology was the first field to specifically assess replicability. And it turned out that when other fields have gone in and tried to assess how well they can replicate their findings, some of them have had even bigger problems. Cancer genetics has a worse replication problem than social psychology does. And everybody would consider genetics a real science. Artificial intelligence. If you've ever worked with an AI or a deep learning model, you know that they're very, very sensitive to their hyperparameters. And the thing is, when people publish the results of their developmental work and algorithms, they often don't give every single detail that you need, and a lot of it makes a difference. And so AI does not replicate on a consistent basis. And I'd be willing to bet that basically every field that has specifically tried to replicate things has struggled the same way that social psychology or cancer genetics or AI has. I think it's common. And so part of this is motivated by the experience of my academic field. And again, I read an article this week that talked about, well, psychology is not a real science because it doesn't build on major findings. And I go, mental life matters, and the way that people think matters. And no, it does. And we've got huge amounts of research to say that it matters. It's true. A lot of the little bitty findings, they may be little things around the edges. And the fact that a lot of them don't, the smaller studies don't matter, but I think the general patterns are very solid. And so it's frustrating to see that happening on a regular basis. But another place where this happens, and this is why I'm talking about it here today, is in data work. And first off, you understand the generalizability problem. And you're probably familiar with the challenge of overfitting, that if you're developing, if you're a model, if you're doing a statistical analysis on a data set, you run the risk of developing something that is too specific to that data set. And so you develop a model with 1,000 parameters, and it can predict what's in that particular data set very, very well. But as soon as you try to take it somewhere else, it crashes and burns. This is a very common thing when software as a service or data as a service is put into production models. It almost never performs as well as it did. It's the same way, you make a prediction about political polls, and what we have learned here in the US is you can predict one thing from your polls, but what actually happens on election day, well, sometimes it's a totally different matter. And the generalizability becomes a major, major challenge. The other thing is I have sometimes seen people use models, they're doing their analyses and, just basic mistakes are made. So, for instance, uh, people don't check for missing data. They don't check for um, skewed distributions or outliers, which can throw off models. They don't standardize their variables before doing a cluster analysis. I've been guilty of that. I did a cluster analysis without standardizing. I got some crazy results. And then when somebody pointed that out, we standardized, we did it again. We got much more stable results that we went through. And so mistakes can be made, but what happens even more often is that either the sample, the sampling process that you use to get your original observations, it's very hard to get a sample that is truly representative of the population that you're going to be launching things out to. And that distance between what you built your model on and what you're actually trying to apply it to, that leads to things falling apart sometimes. And there's also the simple matter of, do you understand the question clearly in the beginning? And so if you conduct a study on a faulty premise, even if you have a representative sample, even if you have done all of your proper data cleaning, you can still end up with something that's not very useful and falls into Sturgeon's 90% of everything is crap category. And so it's not a matter of getting, totally depressed and saying it never works. It is a matter of doing your homework, making sure you know what's going on, and understanding that even under the best of circumstances, things don't always work out. And I would love to take a couple minutes and I would love to hear from some of you about your own experiences. Um, what projects have you worked on that didn't work out as planned? So we'll try that one. Whoops, I lost it. Let's try this. Have you worked on a project or do you know of a project that didn't work out as planned, or that again it crashed and burned and maybe it fell into the 90% that didn't work out? Again, either something that you personally worked on, those are usually the best examples, but again, one that you know from your field. Do you have cautionary tales from your field? And I would love to hear from a couple of you if you have examples of things that did not work as intended, that can serve as an example of, things don't always go exactly right. So if you can think about that for a minute, if you're there, I would love to hear from a few of you. In the meantime, I don't think I said hello to KG or Victor from South Africa. Thank you for joining me. Jason in California, and Raleigh in Texas, and Syed in Saudi Arabia. Again, thank you so much for joining. And if you have any comments about projects that you've worked on where maybe things did not work out as you originally planned, I'd love to know about those. And since they say one of the hallmarks of quality teaching is the ability to withstand silence, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds of silence to think about that. So I'll just be here and see if anybody has a contribution. Well, oh, wait, Jason has one. Says, I've only worked on school projects. I remember one that I couldn't prove my theory, but I could prove the absence of the opposite. Well, that gets into the pretzel logic of hypothesis testing, and something I try to explain to my students today. You can't prove anything is true, but you can usually prove that something is not true, or rather, you can show that something has a low probability of being true. And yeah, as you followers say, proving the null rather than the theory, I guess, is a good way to prove it. Sometimes the data comes out overwhelmingly in support of the null hypothesis. My field, social psychology, has thrived a lot, and I've talked about this before, on what I call parlor trick studies, where somebody makes a very counterintuitive hypothesis and then they design a very clever study and magically it supports it. Now, I hope that wasn't what you were dealing with. But there are times that you expect something's going to happen and it just doesn't. And that's kind of the way life goes. Life is more complex than our theories are. And even though we have maybe some good reasons for assuming that something's going to happen, doesn't always work out. And so you do end up with a lot of null hypothesis, which, if you remember, is really that what you've got, your data, is just random noise. And that is often the case. And we have another person says they've had the same thing about you end up with the null. I actually had a professor in graduate school who was, I want to say that he had about $10 million in grant money to do an evaluation of a $60 million public health intervention. And it came out with nothing. Basically said, we cannot tell that it made any difference on anything, which is really depressing in a way. But he was able to get a couple of papers out of that and saying what to do when your evaluation shows nothing. So, that was good. But really what I want to say is that it's really important to be patient and to take a long view. Any one project, it's not guaranteed to work out. And the idea also is, if you were doing your work and you know that things are not always going to pan out, you have to be willing to accept some of the ups and the downs. I imagine that some of you at some point in your life have done competitive athletics, and you may have an off day. You may stumble at the beginning of the race. You may fumble the ball. Bad things can happen. And that an important part of being a successful athlete is being able to brush that off, pick yourself back up and get back on it. It reminds me of one of my favorite research findings. And it's I actually was looking this back up today. I saw this as a talk about 20 years ago. There's a psychologist named Dean Keith Simonton who has spent a lot of his time studying creativity. And he has tried to find, he's spent a lot of time looking at what are the things that predict people who become very successful, for instance, as composers of classical music. And so he's actually looking at what he calls eminence. And how can you predict who is going to be eminent? And what's funny is he says, yeah, we have a small number of composers who have had disproportionate influence on the works that are performed these days. If you look at people who were working at least 100 years ago, so we are going to historical, and you're looking at the ones who are composed, who perform most often. It's going to be Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and people like that, Verdi, Wagner. It's going to be a lot of those. And what he said is that the single biggest predictor was the number of pieces they wrote. He said that the hit rate, the percentage of their compositions that became really popular and that lasted, he says that percentage did not differ dramatically from one person to another. He says, or rather, it was consistent for a lot of people. Some people had very high hit rates. Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies, and pretty much all of them are performed on a regular basis. Haydn wrote over 100. Not all of them are performed regularly. Mozart's early symphonies are not performed frequently. Um, but he said the hit rate didn't vary substantially, but that the people who had a lot of pieces that were in the popular repertoire, they simply wrote more. And so the idea is you may not. He says, really, the one thing that's really under your control is how much work do you do. And the more work you do, the more hits you're going to have. And what that means also is being productive is going to be one of the best predictors of having lasting influence. So even if 90% of everything is crap, if only 10% of your work is really good, if you do more work, there's going to be a larger count, a higher frequency of things that fall into that 10% category. I've only published 7 academic papers, and I have one that counts as a hit. I know other people who have published over 100 academic papers, and it does vary from field to field. They're going to have several that are hits. Um, and the same thing is true in doing your data work. If you work on a lot of different projects, some of them won't work out just because you're working with something that's very hard to model, or the data is just not adequate to the question. But if you do enough different projects, you will get things that work out beautifully. And obviously, you develop experience in that process. Um, and all of us are working with data in one way or another. I assume that's why you're here. And if you're able to work with things on a regular basis, both you develop the skills, you learn how to work in your application, in your language more efficiently, you learn what is more likely to be productive in a project, and you learn how to phrase it and present it so it has greater impact. I mean, I try to tell people things they can do to make that happen. So you do develop better skills, which I do think means you're going to have a higher, hit rate, percentage of successful hits on what you're doing. But just doing more of the work, more of the project is going to make a difference. I have recorded, um, I record videos all the time. I have made hundreds of videos. I may have even made 1,000 videos by now. I'm learning better what goes into it. I've made about 3 dozen courses for LinkedIn Learning, and they vary in their success. I can tell you that some of the ones I am proudest of did not do very well, in part because they're on very niche topics. Um, but I have learned that even though some of my courses take off and some of them don't, that's fine. A little bit's beyond my control. I can learn to do my work a little more effectively, and I can learn to work with data a little more effectively. One of the great things that's coming up is I'm doing an event, a data service event. We're going to do it right here on the campus at Utah Valley University, and it's something called the Data Charrette. If you go to my website, datalab.cc, you'll see a link at the top for it. But the Data Charrette's a service event, and in it, we work with local nonprofits who have data and they have questions, but they just don't know how to answer those questions with the data that they have. And so we get volunteers. We got some volunteers who spend a few days preparing the data. And then we have a single day where we have a whole bunch of volunteers working on the data and preparing presentations for the nonprofits to answer their questions. Not every project's going to work out. Again, sometimes it's just an intractable problem. Um, but we've also learned how to refine the process. I've done this event several times. And for instance, right now I'm in the process of providing materials to make the work as easy as possible for the volunteers. So both guidance on the projects that they work with, as well as sample code, sample presentations to make it easier to increase the probability of things working out successfully, as long as they both understand what the question is clearly and it's a question that can be answered reasonably with the data that we have and that the data are adequate to the task. We've got just a few minutes left, and I'd love to know if any of you want to add comments about your own experience and things that you've been able to do to either recover from some of these, stumbles or find ways to make it less likely that you stumble in the first place. We've got just a few minutes. If you've got some personal experience, I would love to hear from that. In the meantime, Kamran, welcome from Montreal. It's nice to have you here. But what comments do you have about your own experiences? Let me try another question. What do you do to give you the encouragement to continue even when things don't work out the first time? How do you pick yourself back up from something that's limited? Maybe you've got several projects going on simultaneously. Maybe you've got somebody who's got a sympathetic ear. Maybe you buckle down on getting the skills to make it so that you're more successful in the future. Have you tried any of those things? Maybe you just, kind of go cry in bed for a day or two. Um, what helps you get through the hard times in order to be able to continue doing your work and hopefully do better work in the future? I know that for me, one of the best things is the feedback that I get from my videos on YouTube and the feedback I get from my students at the end of the semester, so that even when things get exasperating, I'm able to look at this very positive feedback that I've received from one source or another. That's been important for me. And Jason adds, just keep in mind that everything is a learning opportunity and keep my long-term career goals in mind. I think you're absolutely right, Jason. I think that you can learn when things don't go well, and having the long-term focus is going to make an enormous difference. Again, a particular project might not work out, a particular yeah, any one of them can go, but keeping the long-term focus is going to work out really well. Uh, a couple months ago, I wrote my newsletter, and it was based on a song called "Maybe It's Not My Weekend, but It's Going to Be My Year," and about having persistence when dealing with challenges. And Raleigh agrees with that, Jason. So you got supporters there. Well, folks, once again, with these half-hour sessions, our time gets up pretty quickly. I'm very glad to have you here. Thank you for saying hello. Thank you for joining me from all around the world. It's nice to have our own little global community in here. And I hope you will stay connected. The video recording of this will be available on Facebook, on YouTube, and LinkedIn, I think just within a few minutes of our finishing. But if you want to join with me on LinkedIn, connect with me, I'd be thrilled to follow up with conversations and see how we can support one another in our work. Folks, thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you again.